You're listening to the OCD Stories podcast, hosted by me, Stuart Ralph. The OCD Stories is a podcast dedicated to raising awareness and understanding around obsessive-compulsive symptoms. I do this through interviewing inspired therapists, psychologists, and people who have experienced OCD. Welcome to the OCD Stories. And welcome to episode 293. And in this one, I chat with Micah Howe, who kindly agreed to share his story with us. And in it, I talk to Micah about his OCD story and journey, growing up as an evangelical Christian, his early memories of anxiety, fears of perfection, worries of offending people, how OCD impacted his faith, hoarding behaviors, scrupulosity, health anxiety. We discuss the process of getting therapy and what that was like for him. We talk about his advocacy, medication, setting up an ISDF affiliate in Iowa, words of hope, and much, much more. Wide-reaching episode. It was really great to get Micah's story and his perspective and his mindset around it now and how it's changed over the years. And thanks always to NoCD for supporting the show. I deeply appreciate it. If you want to find out more about NoCD and their therapy services, head to go.treatmyocd.com/the OCD stories or click the link in the episode description. So thank you to Micah for his time, and to you guys, as always, thank you for listening. I deeply appreciate it. And without further ado, here he is. Welcome to the show, Micah.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you here. And as you know, it'll be good to hear your OCD story, little or otherwise, in as much detail.
Yeah, so I guess I'll start from the beginning. I grew up in rural Iowa. So for your listeners in Europe and other parts of the world, Iowa is in the Midwestern United States. I grew up in a small, farming community, essentially. So when I was growing up there, I'm going to ballpark that we had, maybe 2,500 people in town. People used to joke that we had the only stoplight in the county. So yeah, pretty small. I was an only child, just had a couple of dogs in the house, in addition to me and my parents. And I was adopted. So that was another kind of interesting part of growing up for me. And was in a conservative evangelical Christian family. And that was a big part of our kind of moral structure and how we viewed the world. And I'm still an evangelical Christian to this day. But definitely, especially in part because of my mental health issues, have deviated a little bit from some of the stigmas that I was raised on. And I'll probably get into that a little bit later. But no, I had a fairly normal childhood for a great portion of my growing up years. I was a really precocious kid, very talkative, showed a lot of promise. Didn't really get the sense that I was really going to have much in the way of mental health concerns. But then in sixth grade, I had the first kind of hiccup, I guess I would say, where we started to realize that maybe there was something that was going on with me. And it presented rather unusually. I started having some gastrointestinal issues. I was having trouble keeping food down. So, like any parents do, my parents took me to the doctor, and these issues with digesting food properly, went on for months. And so we ended up seeking out specialists and doing a lot of tests. And in the end, the specialists said, we found some minor physical explanations for what is going on with Micah. But for the most part, we think that this is anxiety driven. We think that Micah is, stressed out about things at school and taking a lot of pressure on himself that a typical child his age isn't, and that is causing some issues with physical health. And so they ended up suggesting that I work with a child psychologist. And so I basically ended up homeschooling for the remainder of my sixth grade year, while we worked with the local public school to get my assignments brought to the house. And I sort of finished the year that way. And then, things sort of kind of died down a little bit. And by the time it was time to go to seventh grade, I was feeling better and I wanted to go back to school and I missed my friends. And so we kind of thought, okay, this is a good sign. This is kind of an aberration. And maybe, it's just a phase. But the one thing that sticks out to me about that period that I remember is that we were sitting with a child psychiatrist at one point, and he recommended to my parents that I be put on some medication for anxiety, and particularly because of the conservative Christian background we were in. That didn't sit very well with my parents. They really were resistant to the idea of me taking medication. And I remember there was just some real firm hesitance, and we didn't end up taking this psychiatrist recommendations. And so, I from there, I kind of just was an episode, and I moved on to junior high, into high school. And, again, no issues that were debilitating. Those issues would develop later. But looking back, I am able to see, if we would have known what we were dealing with, we could have started to see some of these issues developing. I remember in middle school just having some really unusually irrational fears. One of them being dancing. I remember being in middle school, and I remember, there would always be like, this much money to this weekend go to, the auditorium, and there'll be pizza and you can get in and everybody will dance and have a great time. And I remember just thinking, why do they think we like this? Why do they think middle school students want to do this? I mean, why would we want to get around with our peers and move to music when nobody really knows how to move to it? And I just thought, this just sounds so awkward and so silly. And I just can't believe people would even pay to be a part of something like this. I just had this real strong resistance to that, and was just so self-conscious about dancing. And I just remember not wanting to be a part of those things at all, and just getting a lot of anxiety around it. I remember also being really fascinated, at that junior high, early high school age, where people are starting to notice the opposite sex and starting to, take interest in one another. And I remember just almost looking at, people that would be holding hands around school or something, or going to a dance together. And I just remember kind of, how is that happening? How are they pairing off like that? Because in my mind, it was just like, I just couldn't even fathom expressing romantic interest in someone and giving them the chance to reject me, right? Because in my mind, it was like, if I express that I'm interested in someone and they don't feel the same way, everyone in the school is going to know, and I'm going to be made fun of all the way through high school, and high school graduation is the only thing that's going to end that. I mean, just horrible catastrophizing of how things were going to go. But I just had a lot of fears about that. It really affected my social life, even if I didn't talk about it. But again, it was something where I just thought, I'm thinking some things that are unusual, but again, they weren't debilitating. They weren't really ruining my life. And so on I went to high school, and as high school set in, I started to become very fearful of anything less than perfection academically. And the irrational fears went from, being afraid of some kind of social humiliation to, if I get anything less than an A, I'm gonna miss out on some opportunities later in life, and I'm never gonna get over the regret. And so I just became obsessive about my grades. I was checking things over and over. If there was a worksheet that needed to be turned in, if there was a test, a quiz, I was there, the last one after class, checking and checking and checking. When I would study for tests, I would often pull all-nighters, in high school. I was just, really, really intense about the academics. I would try to memorize my notes before tests. Just really overdoing it. And then some of the fears and some of the OCD behaviors. Again, I wasn't diagnosed at this point. This is just all looking back on these things in retrospect. But I started apologizing all the time. I would take a teacher aside after class and, hey, I'm really sorry if, I wasn't looking at the board when you were talking, or, apologizing to friends, all for things that nobody would apologize for. But I just had this real intense fear that maybe I've offended someone, and I've got to make it right. And then, of course, I was also, seeing some of these obsessive tendencies affecting, my expression of my faith. Like I said, I was a Christian. I was active in my church, and I would write these large outlines for my prayer times, all the things I had to remember. And I would spend hours just going through these lists that I had made, making sure that I had prayed everything correctly. It's kind of an interesting aside. I was watching either Hulu or Netflix recently, and there was a movie on one of those streaming networks with Clint Eastwood, $1 Million Baby, where he's a boxing coach. And there's this scene in the movie where he plays this kind of rough around the edges guy, and he goes into his bedroom at night and he says something I can't remember exactly what he says, but he says something to the effect of, God, take care of my daughter. I want everything to go well with her. And then, everything else I want. No sense in me repeating myself. And I just really chuckled at that, because I never thought about it like that. I never thought, what am I doing? I've got these huge lists and I'm saying it over and over again. And yet I also embrace a theology that God is all knowing. But I never put those two together. I never saw the conflict there. But again, these things weren't debilitating yet. And actually, because we didn't really know what we were looking for, we didn't really act on these things and see, fast forward a few years, this is going to continue to get worse. And it wasn't just that we didn't, as a family, know what we were looking at. It was also that these behaviors, as frustrating and disturbing and laborious as they were also yielding me great results in academics. There was a reward for all of this. And so I just kind of, okay, well, this is not fun, but I guess this is what being hardworking looks like. I guess this is the price you pay, to be a great student or whatever. And so there was kind of some reinforcement of these tendencies. And so that was essentially childhood through high school. But it wouldn't be until college when these things would really start to get more severe. I remember after I graduated from high school in 2008, I went off to a Bible college where I was going to train to go into ministry. That was the hope at that time. And I had a real hard time with the college transition. All of a sudden, it was a lot of change, and a lot of the supports that I was used to having, they weren't there anymore. And I distinctly remember feeling so helpless because I was homesick, but in a nostalgic sort of way. And what I mean by that is I remember missing home. and then realizing there's nothing to go back to. All of my friends are off at their own colleges doing their own thing. And I just remember feeling like I'm missing a chapter of life that I'm never going to be able to get back to. And I had a really hard time coping with that. And for reasons I can't explain, I started collecting things to deal with that stress. Things that didn't even really make sense. Maybe it was a few books at a bookstore or some coffee mugs, but I started these hoarding behaviors. And I don't even think I would have called them hoarding behaviors back then, but it was the start of kind of this collecting to sort of handle and cope with these things that kind of began at that time. And in addition to the collecting, my OCD amplified. I was just as serious about my grades in college for the same reason I was serious about my grades in high school, right? And yet at college, it's a lot more intense. It's a lot harder to do all the rituals and be as intense about things as I was in high school. And so that was wearing me out. I was not sleeping well. And I started to get these unique obsessions, even more so around listing. I distinctly remember, I can't remember if it was in the orientation trainings at college, but there was kind of this messaging that, you need to have a planner and you've got to have a schedule, and people who write down their goals are much more likely to accomplish them. And my OCD just ran with that, right? And I'm writing everything down, and just just real adamant about I got to write everything down. And so pretty soon I've got so many lists. I mean, it's as good as not writing anything down because I've written so much down. There's no point in finding anything on any of those lists. And so that became a really concerning issue. And then my scrupulosity also started to come to the forefront. There was this really interesting grading system at the Bible college that I went to where they asked us to read articles or books. And rather than always quiz us on these things, they would ask us to write an on your honor statement about what percentage of the reading we had completed. And my OCD just had a heyday with this. I mean, I just remember thinking like, how can I give an honest percentage? Are we going by pages? Are we going by the number of words, the number of letters on a page? I mean, I was slicing and dicing and psychoanalyzing this every way I could. And I would read and reread and reread because my OCD would tell me, if you read a statement and you didn't fully comprehend it, that's not the kind of reading they're talking about. And so I would go back and do it over and over, all to say all of these things ended up being so exhausting that I dropped out of college after a semester. I could not keep up with the rituals. I could not keep up with the lack of sleep and the stress. And so I ended up stepping out of college and I came back home, and I was devastated. I had all these dreams and these ambitions and they had kind of been put on pause after just a semester. And that caused depression to set in. I was sleeping a lot. And my hoarding then started to change. And I wasn't just hoarding books or coffee mugs. But again, for reasons I can't entirely explain, now I was hoarding recyclables. I was hoarding garbage. I was hoarding pop bottles. And I was spending most of my time each day sitting in my room, going through all the lists I had made over the last semester because I still believed that I can't move forward with my life until I go through all these lists of all these things I'm supposed to remember. And I put together a structured plan of what I'm going to do next in my life and how I'm going to move forward. And so I ended up seeing a doctor about the depression because I was sleeping so much and I didn't have any energy. and ended up on an antidepressant that seemed to give me a little bit of spunk, a little bit of motivation. And so it wasn't long after that I decided I'm gonna give college another shot, and I'm gonna go back. And so I went back. I ended up transferring to another school, and I went back, and a lot of the same rituals all set in all over again. And that made me even more depressed, to the point where I wasn't showering for days at a time. I was having a really hard time keeping up with laundry and that sort of thing. And so it got to a point where, my roommates kind of complained to the residence life that, he's really difficult to live with, and he's not really doing the best with his hygiene. And so that led to me deciding I can't do college again. And so I dropped out again. And I ended up back at home again, only this time, there were more things going on in life than the last time. My parents were really struggling in their marriage, and there were a variety of other tumultuous things going on. So what ended up happening is that I ended up living by myself at this time, because of some difficult issues going on in the family. And at that point, my OCD and my hoarding just went through the roof. I felt like, my parents are about to divorce, which they would end up doing that. And, I had tried college multiple times and it wasn't working out. And so I ended up keeping a lot more garbage than before. And there were layers of this that came on that I was not used to. A big part of the reason I was hanging on to garbage is because I was afraid that the police were going through my garbage, or that they would, which made no sense at all, because I was doing nothing illegal and there was no reason that they would look through my garbage. But the OCD really convinced me that I needed to be afraid of that. Got to the point where I've got insects all over the place. There's maggots on the counter. And I spent just a massive amount of time, literally hours and hours a day, just pacing around this apartment I was in, ruminating, talking to myself about these existential and theological conundrums that I was so worried about. And it was easily, the darkest time of my life, where I realized I have got to get some kind of treatment, and I know I've got some issues here, and I'm not even sure exactly what they are, but I knew I needed a lot of help. And I often, I think about, those times, and I definitely didn't want to be around anymore. I mean, I definitely was miserable, but I'm always hesitant to really say that I dealt much with suicidal ideation, because as much as I didn't want to suffer anymore, I was also terrified of doing anything to harm myself. The OCD kind of, played the other side of the situation there, where, maybe you're going to botch the attempt in some way and you'll end up disabled, and you'll be, even more miserable than you currently are. Or, maybe what you think about your relationship with God is wrong, and you'll end up in hell. I mean, I was terrified. And so out of this kind of, desperation, I started seeking treatment. I started seeking help. And at first, like I said, we were part of this conservative evangelical community where they thought about mental health very differently. So when I started seeking treatment, at first, they had very spiritual explanations for what was going on. Maybe there's some kind of issue in your relationship with God that we need to look into. And so they, kind of thought, well, maybe you need to kind of make amends with, people maybe that you've, wronged. And maybe that'll kind of make this better. And so again, OCD just went crazy with that. And I kid you not, I was thinking back to people I had borrowed pencils from in high school that I didn't give back. Right. And then pretty soon it went to, well, what if I don't need to just, make amends with individuals? What if I need to make amends with society? What about all those times that, maybe I drove over the speed limit, but a police officer wasn't there to see it happen? Do I need to go down to the courthouse and just give them some money to cover the tickets I would have had, if somebody would have seen it? It just went on and on and on. And part of the reason it took me so long, and this is why I'm so passionate about helping people in religious communities with mental health concerns, is because part of the reason it took so long for me to seek out help and ERP and that sort of thing is because in the conservative Christian environment that I was raised in, there was a lot, and still is to this day, a lot of skepticism about secular treatment of mental health, about secular therapy. And so we really had this idea that, if the people that we are seeking for mental health care, if they don't share our faith values, if they're not of our same religious tradition, we can't trust their guidance, or they might damage me spiritually in some way. But eventually I was so miserable and things were not working that I just stepped out and I just said, I know some of the people in my faith community don't entirely agree with secular treatment, but I need help. And so we ended up seeking secular treatment. And it was a process. We went to several therapists that said they could help, but it didn't entirely work out that way. But eventually ended up working with a couple of therapists that were familiar with ERP, and worked with one of them for a little while on an outpatient basis. And eventually he just said, Micah, I think you need to go to something more intensive, than the once a week work that we are doing. And so I ended up at a partial hospitalization program the first time for several months. And then I relapsed, and then I went back for another period of months. But that's where I encountered ERP. And that's where I encountered a type of therapy that was totally different than anything I'd ever experienced. It absolutely changed my life and helped me get some traction. I went into therapy, thinking that we're gonna answer all these questions that I'm struggling to live with. And instead, it was the opposite. We're going to teach you to live with the fact that there aren't any answers for these things. And that was the hardest thing about my treatment, but it was an absolute turning point, and I was able to find hope there that was just unbelievable, and I didn't even know was possible. And so, kind of fast forwarding to recent years up to the present day. I've been doing a fair amount of advocacy, talking with legislators about mental health and public policy. I've been real fortunate to be involved with the International OCD Foundation. They have just been so integral in my recovery and offering me opportunities to do advocacy. And I'm in the process of helping launch an affiliate in Iowa of the IOCDF. And then also in the process of starting my own business to try and help educators and business owners and others who don't have mental health issues better understand the problem from a sufferer's perspective. So it's just been an unbelievable roller coaster over the last several years. And here I am now, talking to an advocate with such a brilliant accent on the other side of the world. I never could have imagined this years ago, but I'm so grateful for it. That's essentially my story.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing. And there's so much in it, and a couple of things. Well, many things that stood out to me, but a couple of things were like what you said there about culturally, as in, or at least within the religion, and not wanting to trust secular therapists or therapy or therapeutic methods. I'm glad you brought it up. I think it's an important one, and it's not just in Christian cultures. You'll hear this across religions. It was on one of the podcasts the other day. From a Muslim perspective, it's similar to exactly what you just said, And that's not to say all religions like that, but I think it's worth saying that. And I understand the fear, why it exists. But yeah, I'm glad that your story kind of shows that there isn't necessarily need to be a fear, you know? And yeah, I always look as they go hand in hand. It's a gift from God, whether it's a Christian counselor or not. It's divine intervention is how I would choose to look at it, or do, I guess. The other thing was, I'm blanking here. Yeah, so in terms of, so you're really showing how OCD just kind of kept finding a way, and it kept twisting and going a step further. And so no matter how many rituals you did, it said, yeah, but what about this? Well, have you thought about, and I think that was a beautiful illustration, a beautiful and scary illustration of what OCD actually does. The compulsions don't solve anything. It just creates more questions and more. Yeah, it's almost like this map getting bigger and bigger and bigger, people can't see my hands, but they're moving away. So when you were in partial hospitalization, because actually before you got there, as you said, your symptoms got really severe and it was really dominating your life and your existence. Because I can imagine people listening who are in that place, or maybe feel they're getting to that place and they're like, this is never going to get better. Here you are talking to me saying you did get better. How quick did that shift for you? Or at least, yeah. I'll do that.
Yeah. So, I would definitely say that looking back, hindsight's 2020, right? But I would always say it would have done wonders for me to get to treatment sooner, because it was a process, but it did get better once I started working with specialists that knew how to treat OCD. And once they helped me make that paradigm shift, that I'm not going to be able to get rid of anxiety. I'm learning to live my life even while I feel anxiety. And I'm that was huge for me. That was just a massive shift in approach for me, to be able to recognize that I have to be able to live with certain amounts of uncertainty. I have to be able to tolerate that, because, like you said, OCD it never runs out of ammunition if you can't tolerate uncertainty, because it never runs out of things that have uncertainty. And so I just had to really, really accept that, the nature of reality is that there's so much uncertainty, and either reality has to change or I have to change, or I'm going to be miserable indefinitely. And when therapy helped me understand, the therapist that I worked with really helped me understand, Micah, you've got to stop chasing certainty. It's like you said, the compulsions just get you deeper. They don't get you anywhere. And once I realized, okay, I can't change the nature of reality. I want to, OCD wants me to, but I can, with the help of my treatment team, change me. Yeah. And that was just, absolutely epiphanous for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. It sounds like the mindset and the mind shift was just absolutely massive for you. And you may not remember, but what was the first time you did an exposure response prevention therapy exercise? Do you remember that first ever sort of exposure? And what was that like?
I remember, I can't really say if I remember what the first exposure actually was, but I remember
more the experience,
my thoughts and feelings. I remember my thoughts and feelings when it got started. And I remember feeling so weird. I remember being there in the partial program, and I remember that they were explaining to me, we're going to do some things that create a little bit of anxiety for you. And then you're going to write down a number. You're going to rate it. And I remember thinking in my head, wow, I've really gotten this bad, that we're now doing like experimental goofy therapy. I had no confidence it was going to work. Right. I really felt like, is this really how bad I've gotten, that we are using, methods that are this out of the box? I just remember having no confidence in it at all, but really feeling like I have nothing to lose. Okay, I'll try. It made no sense to me, like with imaginal exposures, for example. It was so counterintuitive that, well, we're just going to keep rehearsing in your head what scares you. And eventually it's not going to be as scary anymore. And that was really more than I could put a lot of confidence in early on. But I was absolutely amazed when I started doing it. It wasn't something that, oh, wow, I just did a couple scripts and, I feel it, it wasn't that at all. But I remember doing it for a few weeks and maybe a few weeks into treatment, waking up and thinking, I don't know how this is possible, but that thought is markedly less terrifying than it was when we started. And that's where really hope started to set in again.
Well, thank you for sharing. And, OCD was starting to get really bad for you in high school and then even really worse in college. Those are quite sort of formative years. So I guess what's my question here? How, since you've gone through therapy and then maybe you've done other stuff since, has there been like a rebuilding for you in terms of like finding out who you are, what you like, what you enjoy, and all that type of stuff?
Yeah, I think that's actually been a big part of the last several years is recognizing that, a lot of us are, we're in the process of finding who we are. We're in the process of doing something when OCD hits, and a lot of times defers or puts those things on pause. So yeah, there's definitely been a period of time that I think I'm still growing through in my early 30s of trying to think, okay, now that I have managed this a lot better than I did in my early 20s rather, what does the rest of life look like now? I'm kind of, it's like the pause button has been hit for several years, and now I'm kind of pushing play again. And trying to figure out, okay, like, what am I doing? How am I moving forward? So yeah, there is that sense of a lot of the self-discovery that would have happened, early 20s into the mid 20s has definitely been delayed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like that you said self-discovery as kind of a term. I think that can also be used in replace of recovery. It's like this journey of finding out who you are and what you like, which I think every human has to do. But someone, like you're saying, is gone through this delay almost, as you said, like the pause button. And in terms of like your faith, I'm sure OCD tried to give your faith a good kicking over the years, and I'm sure it affected your beliefs. How did faith come in terms of your recovery? How did it help you? Did it, just anything on that?
So, I think that for me, I might have a little more of an unorthodox, explanation for that. For me, my faith, it certainly provided some solace and some motivation. For me, I think as a Christian, I was able to take comfort in the fact that, in the Bible, there are a lot of people who God loved, that he allowed to suffer things that didn't seem fair. And I certainly took solace in that. But honestly, a great part of what helped me recover was recognizing that a lot of the issues that I thought were spiritual were mental health issues. A lot of these, ways I was worrying about things, they weren't necessarily evidence of a spiritual or a faith related problem. They were evidence of a mental health problem. And so ironically, some of the most comforting things for me in treatment were discovering, oh, these aren't spiritual issues. I don't have these, flawed problems. Like once I start, I'm so worried that, God is angry with me, for example. And then, when I start taking my medication, it starts to lessen. And I was like, okay, well, I really don't believe my medication is affecting my soul. My medication is doing something to my brain. And all of a sudden, my sense of who God is starting to become more like what people tell me it should be. And that was huge for me, because I was told in so many different ways that you're having spiritual issues, or maybe this is somehow related to some sort of spiritual warfare or something to that effect. And I just realized, well, whatever quote unquote demons are bothering me, I'm kind of amazed that antidepressants are so effective against them, and that really helped me to frame that, this is much more of a mental health issue than a spiritual issue, and that I had, been barking up the wrong tree for a while.
Yeah, really good point. And that goes back to, I guess, what you said at the start, how you still have your very much same religious beliefs, but some of the extra stuff that you brought up around it, you've kind of dropped off. And is that kind of an example of that? Yeah,
that's a perfect example of where I still believe the core aspects of evangelical Christianity, but some of the aspects of evangelical culture and the way that sometimes evangelical culture talks about mental health, those are things that I've backed away from a little more and thought about differently.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. What was my next? Yeah. So with the setting up the ISDF affiliate in Iowa, which is awesome, because no doubt you'll do a lot of like good awareness and campaigns to I guess try and get more therapy in the state. But yeah, where are you at with that, and like what are some of your hopes and plans for it, if you can share?
Yeah. So it is in the very early stages at this point. We are still, the pandemic certainly put a little bit of a halt on getting new things started. So we are working at it. If anybody happens to be listening that is from Iowa and wants to be involved, absolutely now is the time to reach out. We're in the process of trying to put a board together, and so it's in the early goings, but I'm really excited that we've got it started. And as far as our vision and our hope for it, I think first and foremost it's really to help people facing OCD in areas where there's not a lot of awareness about it and there's not a lot of resources. Not only be willing to talk about it and believe that, yes, this is a real thing, but also be able to become aware of the types of resources that are evidence-based, that make a difference for people. One of the things that I struggled with is when I didn't have the IOCDF, when I started struggling, I was just, guessing, going to Google, looking for mental health professionals. If they said they dealt with anxiety, I went to them, and I had no idea that, especially with something like OCD, there's a very specific type of treatment that you need to be aware of. And so helping people become aware of those things, because so much time and money, and heartache is spent trying to find those things out on your own by trial and error.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, no, it sounds awesome. And how would people get in contact with you or whoever they need to?
Yeah. So if they're looking to get in contact with me about OCD Iowa, they can reach me at info@ocdiowa.org.
Cool. Yeah, let's do. So I guess for people listening, are there any words of hope for them?
I think I would say to a sufferer like myself that like I said, kind of at the outset of the show, I'm in a place right now with opportunities that I just never imagined. 5-6 years ago when I started therapy. I think sometimes we really, as we're trying to recover, we think about what seems reasonable to me, what seems feasible, what do I think right now in the midst of my struggles that I can become. And what I've discovered is you can become so much more, you can recover to such a greater degree than you ever imagined possible in your worst moments. And it's just about pushing through and doing the right things, with therapy and the guidance of a treatment team. And by doing that, it hasn't changed things for me overnight, but day after day, month after month, year after year, if I look at where I am today and where I was 4 months ago, the difference is not that staggering. But if I compare where I am today to where I was 3 or 6 years ago, it's unbelievable. I mean, when I was in treatment, I was, just getting to treatment on time, showering, I was in a terribly difficult place. So, yeah, I would encourage people, whatever stage of the journey that they are in, to understand that when you're connected to the right help, like ERP and some of the other resources that the OCD community talks about, these things do work over time, even if when you start them, like in my case with ERP, it doesn't make a lot of sense. It's a process that's worth trusting, I've found in my experience. And I've also found that the more I was willing to challenge myself, the more that I grew. When I was willing to push myself and feel some anxiety, that really helped me make some strides.
Yeah, beautiful words. And I guess the question that came for me there then is, where are you at now with OCD?
With OCD now, I'm doing significantly better. The thoughts are still there. The intrusive thoughts are still there. I still have bad days. I still have anxiety that is really overwhelming. But I think the biggest difference between who I am now getting through this, even though it's challenging, versus before being completely sidelined by OCD, is that acceptance piece, right? That ability to say, I am terrified today that there's a brain tumor growing in my head, but I'm going to eat breakfast just the same. And that has made the difference. I mean, my anxiety certainly has lessened over time, but the biggest life transforming difference for me has been the ability that treatment helped me learn to react differently to these thoughts and to say, it is very hard some days to not get online and seek a bunch of reassurance from WebMD, for example. But as hard as it is to resist that, I do have the ability to choose to say, okay, I'm going to tolerate this for now. And I think for the longest time, I just had these expectations about life that you have to have total peace to live your life. You have to have all the uncertainties that bother you settled before you finish college, before you engage in meaningful relationships, before you chase the career goals you have before you get married, before you have kids, whatever it is. And therapy really helped me to see that life is not so cookie cutter. And I have to be willing to, if I guess to put it a different way, I really learned that if I wait to do the things that I want to do with my life until I have perfect peace about everything, they'll never get done. I'll never start. And that was, again, another one of those paradigm shifts for me that was just absolutely crucial.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Yeah. The when you said like the cookie cutter life, the thing that came to me was like, our life isn't a Hollywood movie. It's not, it's not polished. It's not perfect. It's messy, and that's okay. You know?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And you know, so obviously therapy was huge, medication, you know, your faith. Was there anything else along the way that's been helpful for you on your journey, or is helpful to this day?
Yeah, you know, I am someone who I enjoy like any. I mean, it depends on the topic, but on a lot of different topics, I really enjoy different types of thought leadership. I really have found great value in connecting with the thoughts of other people, whether that is you know, reading books or, you know, I know sometimes in past episodes that I've heard you do, you'll ask people about the quote that they would put on a billboard or something.
That's coming, don't worry.
And okay. But well, I won't spoil it early then. But no, I love that because I really find a lot of value for me personally in getting a hold of quotes, of ideas that awaken something in me, right? That really strike a nerve with me and give me that drive to think about my suffering differently, or that motivate me to believe something is possible that I previously didn't think was possible. I think the worst thing I did in the early years of my struggles was the amount of isolating that I did, where I didn't expose myself to other people's thoughts very much. I didn't get a lot of input. And as soon as I started saying, okay, I'm going to read some more books, I'm going to listen to some more people give their thoughts on suffering, on business, on mental health, it stretched me to think, wow, things are possible. I have written myself off far too quickly. And there are people out there, some of them suffering far worse than I am, and they are doing things that I've already told myself I can't do. And that has been huge for me.
Yeah, I love that. Someone once told me, which I love this quote, which is just that success leaves clues. So, you know, if you want to be successful in a particular area, find others that have done that, whatever you consider success, and look at it and you'll see clues on how they did it. Yeah. And I think anyone listening to this podcast and podcasts generally, they're usually the people like you who are just hungry to learn and grow. And yeah. So next question is, which one am I doing first? 20-year-old self. So you pick up the phone and call the 20-year-old you. What'd you tell him?
Yeah, you know, so I'm 31 now. So, you know, go backwards 11 years. This is a real great segue into what we just discussed, because, you know, 20-year-old me was just crumbling, struggling so acutely. And I think if I could tell 20-year-old me anything, it would be to be patient and to be willing to pivot. You know, as I've been exposed to the ideas of business leaders and read their stuff, and how they got through adversity, the thing that strikes me so profoundly is when I was 20, my idea of success was, I have got to overcome the challenges in front of me. I had a plan, and I'm going to get back to that plan, and I'm going to do the plan. So I need to graduate college by 22. OCD's getting in the way. I've got to get back to college full-time ASAP. And yet, as I started to learn and read successful people who have overcome a lot, what you see in a lot of them is their willingness to change directions because what they wanted at one time just isn't working anymore. And they don't see that as failure. They see that as a strength. They see that as, I learned to tweak what I was doing. I learned to evolve. And that has been transformative for me as well, to realize that part of my struggles in my early 20s was that I was having a hard time accepting, all right, Micah, you've got a debilitating mental health condition. That doesn't mean you can't do what you wanted to do, but it probably does mean you're going to have to approach some things differently and be willing to make some adjustments. And once I was willing to make adjustments, once I was willing to open myself up to some different possibilities, that's where breakthroughs came from. And the longer I insisted that I've got to do this the way I've always seen myself doing it, my life has to go on the trajectory that I've always wanted it to go on, that ended up being really limiting for me.
Yeah, I think as you say that, that the mindset you were just talking about is the opposite of OCD anyway, because being flexible and willing to change and adjust and adapt is living in that uncertainty, Yeah. Okay, so now the billboard question. What do you want written on that billboard?
Yeah.
In that town of 2,500.
Yeah, right. So I'm one of these people, like we had said, with loving quotes and the energy that they can give. I'm kind of always cycling, what my favorite quotes are at the moment. So I think the best way to answer this is probably just to give you the two quotes that have really hit me lately. I think the first one is a quote by George Eliot, which is that it's never too late to be what you might have been. And that has just been so meaningful to me in my mental health journey, because I think so many of us that are dealing with mental health issues, we had dreams and goals that got put off for a while, and we're wondering, is it too late for me to go revive that thing that mental illness got in the way of? Is it too late for me to start something new? And it's like that quote just like got into my gut and just gave me permission. And I don't even know why, but I just was like, there are no rules about you have to be this age to start this kind of career. And the fact that you tried it 7, 10, 15 years ago and it didn't work out means that was your try and you can't try again. That's not anywhere. It's just a social idea that came along that's not how people live life. And like you mentioned, very aptly, OCD wants to tell us that, right? That this was the time frame you were supposed to do that in, and it didn't happen. So now it's gone. So that's been meaningful to me. The other one is a little more abstract. There's a writer by the name of Russell Hoban that said, explorers must be ready to die lost. And that just captivated me because I love the idea that when we talk about people that overcome difficulty, when we talk about people that accomplish great things, we're always talking about how strong they are and how bold they are and how passionate they are. But we're rarely talking about all of the difficult, uncertainties that they lived with. You know, when I was taught about explorers, you know, in grade school, it was always just about how they were visionaries and they wanted to find a new world. We didn't really talk so much about how they lived with the fact that our maps could be wrong and we could be headed to the middle of nowhere and run out of food and water and die a miserable death. And they lived with that for the opportunity to achieve, you know, whatever their ambition was. And it's like, it reminds me of, like, as I've been watching the Olympics here, you know, at this time of year, you know, I love watching the gold medalists, you know, stand on the podium and shed a tear. But ever since I've struggled with OCD, the people that really just like inspire me are the people that in swimming or in track missed the medal podium by a 10th or 100th of a second, right? And I just think to myself, man, you know, they spent all these years of their life and all the dietary discipline and all of the early morning practices, knowing that I could get this close to my dream and still miss it. And they still got up every day to try. They still said, this could end in complete heartbreak, but I'm going to tolerate that uncertainty for the chance at the thing I'm shooting for. And on a much smaller scale, I mean, that is what I'm trying to do with OCD, right? Is say, yeah, I could get a brain tumor. I could drop dead in 5 years. But I'm going to tolerate that uncertainty for the chance to live the life that I've always wanted and that I only get one shot at.
Yeah, you're going for gold.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I love that. I haven't heard that second quote. It's great. Yeah. And what came to my mind is, like, we always hear these adventurers and we think of them being as like really brave people, but I bet when they're like 20,000 feet up a mountain in a blizzard, they're having that same fear that someone with OCD is of, do I take another step? Is this the end for me on this mountain, you know? But we never talk about the sheer terror that they go through. We just talk about the courage, you know? And I just think that's, yeah. But I love the first quote. But that also reminds me, you know, over the years, I've had so many people say, you know, I did an episode on trauma or the trauma of OCD with Chrissy, which is, you know, OCD's taken so much. I've missed so many opportunities. And now they're grieving everything they've lost. And I just love that first quote of, well, it's never too late. You know, you have lost a lot and a good therapist can help you grieve and there are other methods, but it's never too late to be what you might have been. I love that. And yeah, so lastly, is there anything else you wish you could have said or shared today?
I would just say, you know, thanks so much for having me on. I mean, this has been a great conversation. And I just really hope all the listeners, you know, benefit from it and enjoy it. And just want everyone listening to know that, you know, I'm nobody special. I'm just over here, you know, gutting through OCD one day at a time, just like you guys. And, you know, I'm cheering you on to do the same thing, you know, wherever in the world, you know, your journey's taking place.
Amazing. Well, Micah, thank you so much for sharing your story. It's been a real pleasure to hear it and chat with you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. If you enjoy the OCD Stories podcast and would like to support us with a one-time tip/donation, please go to theocdstories.com/support. All tips, no matter how large or small, are greatly appreciated. Please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to the podcast. And thank you to NoCD for supporting our work. If you want to find out more about NoCD, head to go.treatmyocd.com/theOCD stories or click the link in the episode description. And quick disclaimer, guys, this podcast is not therapy. It is not a replacement for therapy. Please seek treatment from a trained professional. And until we speak, take care.